Layman Pascal, how are you?
I'm better than anyone's ever been.
Oh, that's a high standard I hope we can keep it up for this hour and a half, because then you could be better than anyone's ever been for longer than anyone's ever been at that state.
Yeah, I can hold it for a short period of time, but if I slip below that standard, I'm going to blame you.
Okay, well, I'll blame me as well. It's one of my
Okay.
toxic traits. Um, I have this real problem, and I did some research in my audience, and I realized that some of them aren't enlightened yet, and so I had to get you on. And I mean, hopefully, we can get to like 100% enlightenment by the end of this podcast for all of my audience. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm very comfortable with that. I think it's a very achievable goal. Let's get
Good,
to it.
good, perfect. I brought you on originally to talk about the first thing I asked you about was if we could talk about I guess religion and what religion looks like nowadays, because for me at least, I've just encountered quite a few people who are who have left religion after childhood, and they're looking to go back to it, but they haven't quite figured out how to do that. I think old religion isn't necessarily working for a lot of people, but to my best estimation, these kind of new religious communities, and I know you're kind of trying to work on one, but I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in this like newfound community that isn't really based in these old traditions. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, there's such a mixture of things around that theme. I mean, there's something that you don't get when you try a new experiment, right? You don't get all that history. You don't get the weight of that. And there's a good part to that, which is you don't get a whole bunch of the oppressive stuff that goes along with it. And there's a bad part of that, which is you don't get a lot of the built-in significance and the community spirit that goes with that. But I think it is important to, at least for me, it's important to think about religion across different modes of cultural history, right? So that very often we think of religion as what Gebster would call mythic membership religion, right? So they're these large, easily recognized groups. You join by subscribing to a belief system. You have some mythic figure. You've got a mythic book, right? That's one type of religion, right? That didn't really exist like that before there were books or large groups of people, and it's not necessarily appropriate to the time period we live in now. In fact, most of human religion took place in the 200,000 years before buildings and books and writing altogether. So I think it's sometimes important to zoom out and get a sense of what religion is more generally, so that we can get a sense of how we could create religion today like our ancestors did. Because one way or another, some people created it by getting together. Right? So even if we like one, we're sort of excited by the sense that there's this impressive historical weight to a religion we're inheriting. Somewhere along the line, some people got together with practices and ideas and co-created that. So if we can't totally trust those traditions, at least we can try to get together and kind of do what they were doing that generated that religion.
Try to do what our ancestors did, that like the 200,000 year old, and there's this thing that I'm contending with, and I am I'm not meaning to try to debate you. That's not what I wanted. I didn't want to come on here and like try to own Layman Pascal. Not that I think I'm up to that, but like I find myself just bringing up some contention in me, so I just thought I'd bring it to you. But like there's this thing about religion that I found, and I have a lot of basis in like, I was really into Jordan Peterson, for instance. So I'm kind of going to argue for maybe that sort of point of view, where a religion is a society builder, like or the what I mean by religion is the religions that we've had for the last couple, like 5,000 years or 7,000 years or whatever. You see it in Christianity and Islam especially, was like, this is like a religion, and it's also how you structure society. In Judaism is very much the same. Like it's not just about the book. It's about how to tie your shoes and how to interact with other people. And so when we take our ancestors from the past a long time ago, I do wonder if they had the codified laws and the formal rigor that was able to shape a society and keep it stable.
Well, there's an assumption there that codified rules and rigor are essential to making a society stable and creating religious depth. That's not necessarily proven. That's certainly one style that's predominated, but it's predominated in the last few centuries or millennia, right? And that's only a small window of time. So we don't know what the religion of tomorrow looks like. Maybe it looks like a reinvigoration of the forms that we inherit. Maybe it looks like the creation of new forms. Maybe it looks like both of those simultaneously for different temperaments of people. But I think one question we can ask that goes to your point is, what is it that religion does? What does religion do in all of those different modes? And for me, what it fundamentally does is bring forth a numinous quality, an excess coherence that's created as an integration of different aspects of cultural activity. So in my mind, religion is like, it's an activity. It's the religionization of a culture. It's where a culture really starts to come together. And one of the problems, though, is if we inherit the successful cultural integration of previous time periods, we don't know whether or not those forms apply to our current time period. So we have to be able to negotiate between examples from the past where it seemed like it was working and things about the current environment that might be different than the conditions that those people were going through.
I wish I could play that on repeat, but I cannot, alas. Okay. I mean, I think what you're saying is that we have to take, I mean, kind of an integral perspective, which is, I think, a lot of the community that you're associated with is like the integral community of we need to kind of unify all of these different structures, and also, obviously, some of them are not useful for the present day. I wonder how we figure out what's useful for the present day and what's not. Like, there's this idea of don't take down a fence unless you know what's behind it, what it's keeping in. And I think, for me, I have this vague idea of like when the 60s happened, a lot of people took acid, and other things happened as well. But psychedelics, especially acid, I think dissolved barriers in our minds, and I think we had this great dissolution of structures. And it was for the best in some ways, but it was also, I think it also caused a lot of harm, that we were just questioning these things that were there for so long that we didn't realize they were maybe pillars of society. I think like marriage was one. But like we see things like very high, this is just the high horse that I like to hop on, but it's like we see things like really high divorce rates, and those aren't good for kids. But when I go on Reddit or other social medias, it's like as soon as people seem to have problems in their marriage, it's like divorce him, get rid of him. And we don't seem to value, we just don't seem to value a lot of structures that we used to. And
there's a mix there again to me, relative to time frame. Like, I think there are something like conservative and progressive tendencies that we have to be able to negotiate between and integrate in order to make anything happen culturally. So there's this spirit of let's try new things that are up to date, and there's this spirit of let's conserve things from the past, even if we don't completely understand them, because we don't know all the work that they were doing for us. At the same time, people were taking psychedelic drugs for a long time throughout history, right?
Yeah.
So sobriety and marriage are maybe newfangled recent things that are getting in the way of our really old fences, so to speak.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of difference depending on the scope that you use in analyzing these circumstances. But I think it is really important to become emotionally and intellectually capable of trying both experimental religion and culture and revalidating inherited religion and culture, because we just don't know in advance. We can't think it out. We have to go through it and try it out.
Yeah. I think it would be easy to assume, I mean, I just think it would be easy to assume that you're the sort of, at first glance, having never met you, you're maybe a guy who wants to tear down religion, and I don't think that's true at all. I think that you...
Is it the scarf? Is that what gives that impression?
It's the background poster as well. Every hippie house that I know has those like Tibetan prayer flags in it, and nobody ever knows what they mean. or their significance. But I mean, I suppose that's a symbol. Maybe you don't need to know what it means all the time. Maybe your unconscious knows what it means in a way that your conscious doesn't need to. But I think that you have a real appreciation for the sacred and for structures. And I mean, you're just trying to navigate this world in the best way that we can. Like, we have this real problem. I just know so many people who are trying to return to religion and the church doesn't fit them. And I have this friend I just talked to who's like, I want to be Catholic again, but the Catholic Church is so much, of a history. Like, I love the old traditions. I love the sacred spaces and the songs and the hymns, but like, how do you negotiate with these two really heavy energies?
Well, I think a lot of it is that we have to experience each other outside of the content of our thought, right? And that's a skill you develop in spiritual training to some degree, which is analogous to religion. But when you get together with some people who think that they're Christians or think that they're Buddhists, you don't really know anything about them yet, except that they're using a common language, right? One church might be absolutely perfect for you, and the next church might seem like a reactionary, regressive cesspool of evil to you. You just don't know in advance. So there's the sense in which there's all different types, especially of the large religions, and people at all kinds of different personal developmental stages and all kinds of different cultural flavors. So there's a tremendous richness within each of the large religions that we have to be aware of. They're not monolithic, right? There's a great community of integral Christians and integral Buddhists. I did a fabulous interview with a friend of mine, Jared Morningstar, who's a meta-modern Muslim, a couple of months ago. Right, so there's a lot of room for this, and it's an open area for negotiation. But a person who's integral or meta-modern or game B or whatever we want to call that, they'll have more in common with someone else who has that same sensibility from another religion than they might with everyone else in their religion. Because it's a lot more about how you understand and what you embody and how you want to get together with others than about the forms that you use to organize that. Right, so if people are going to bring depth and balance and integration and aliveness and concern for both progress and inheritance together in their Christianity, great. That's the kind of Christianity I can get behind. And if they're not going to do any of those things and they call themselves a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist, I can't really get behind that, because I'm looking, in my mind, to help cultivate a particular type of person and a particular way of being in the world. And that can happen with old forms, it can happen with new forms, because it's about depth of the form and not about the type of the form itself. Even though the type of the form is a very useful tool. Some are better than others.
You are actually cultivating a group of people, aren't you?
Yes and no, in different ways. I'm leading these Metamodern spirituality retreats. I have my own classes, but in generally I feel like I'm trying to contribute to or be of service to or tend the garden of these overlapping thought and feeling communities. Metamodern, Emerge, Game B, the Liminal Web. There's sort of a sense of resonance between these communities that all want to be transdisciplinary, be integrative, find a way to affirm everything and get deeper and more embodied in how they do that. So for me, that's my community. That's the culture I want to bring forward. And then there are these particular projects where I'm sort of taking the lead on that.
It sounds to me like you're kind of going for the spiritual leaders in the community, maybe. I don't know about spiritual leaders exactly, but you're finding the most embodied people and kind of empowering them to go out into their own respective communities and give people the same
Sometimes light. I'm the guy at the front of the room who gives talks or rings the bell for meditation or brings up the spirit of the good for contemplation or something like that. But I think it's important to get the right balance between any kind of leadership role-playing and a sort of deconstruction of the status of leadership, because you don't want to get trapped in old-fashioned social games around status or anxiety or, there's hierarchy in general is not problematic, but there are many forms of problematic hierarchy, and they're often more problematic than we realize. So it's important to not get carried away identifying yourself with a role that you're playing, even though sometimes someone has to play that role.
Mm. How can a person at home who's listening become a more embodied practitioner? I don't know if that's quite the right turn or phrase, but I think you know what I mean.
Well, embodiment, I think, there's some very straightforward things that everybody can do. One is go outside and do your practice, right? Put your feet on the ground, touch the elements. That's pretty basic. But another one that's important is what we might call neurosomatic interoception, right? You can use your nervous system to feel the inside of your body. We have these skills. Interoception and proprioception are more advanced terms for it, but what does it feel like? What are you sensing in terms of just having a body, right? What's the weight of your hands? What do the insides of your toes feel like? Can you sense the stimulation of all the activity of your organs throughout your body, right? And insofar as you can tune your nervous system to pay attention to the sort of whole inner life of the experience of your body, that puts you in a really good place to do any of your other practices in a more embodied way, because it always comes back to the body, and it also helps you not get so lost in your emotional reactions and mental patterns. It's a really good practice for digital technologies as well, because we very often get sort of distressed and over-identified with the content of digital communication coming in from the culture. And if you are remembering to feel the presence of the whole of the inside of your body while you're engaged in the practice of digital technology, or the practice of prayer, or the practice of yoga, or the practice of meditation, you're in a much more grounded, much more stable affordance, let's say. You have like a container in which your other spiritual or religious or social activities can be grounded, can be integrated. They can be mixed in this cauldron if you maintain the cauldron, so to speak.
I found that more embodiment for me means more access to my intuition in a big way. Jesse McKay, we did a leadership intensive with him. I've done it a few times, and he usually starts it off with a full body meditation, and then he says, okay, I want you to be in your body 50% of the time, like 50% in your body, 50% in the outside world the entire time. And then a lot of the practices are just involved with, there's this one practice that we did where he goes, okay, I want you to pick the person in the room that you most want to be partnered with. And so you think about them and just imagine them in your head, imagine going up and asking them saying yes, how happy you are, feel your body. And then he says, now they have to reject you. And so you have to go up to them and you have to say, will you be my partner? And they have to say no. And the practice there is to feel how it feels to be rejected, and also feel how it feels to reject somebody else. And that's it. But it's, for a lot of people, I mean, for me, rejecting other people was actually way more difficult than I thought. And then that night I had these quite vivid dreams about previous times in which rejecting people came up, and it was an issue for me. But I think the body is one of the keys to the intuition and the subconscious.
Yeah, there's an interesting tangent there that might be interesting to go into around intentionally leaning into negative experiences that we might want to explore. But I think the body is hugely important to those kinds of practices. Like, the first thing the body gives you is that you can drop out of just the waking state, intellectual left brain mode. So your intuition is often inhibited by overactivity of one part of your intelligence. So when you return to the body, it's like you decontract and you drop back into a more general organismic intelligence. But there's, I think, a step beyond that, which is, like in the exercise you described, there's actually a variety of different intelligence systems being used there, right? There's your experience of the body, but that's not all that's going on. There's your socially provoked emotional life as well. And you're also able to watch it and think about it. So you've got, in classical terms, heart, mind, and body are all in play in that exercise. And the way I tend to think about spiritual practice, which I think is analogous to religious practice, is that you create harmonies or integrations between different internal systems, and the gestalt effect, the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts that you evoke by getting these different systems to cooperate more intensely inside yourself, is experienced as an additional quality, an additional self, sometimes an additional entity. It sort of affords you this extra resonance of meaningfulness.
Are you saying so the unification between mind, body, and spirit often manifest as a separate entity, or like another layer on top of that, like a?
Yeah, like I would speak very generally. Like I would just call it a phenomenon, and then
Yeah.
that phenomenon can be lensed in different ways, right?
What
So
are
one
some
of the
ways
classic
it's
ways.
lensed as? Oh,
Well, first, second, and third person is a classic way to talk about it philosophically in the integral tradition. So, right, I might say I might experience this extra quality that I've produced or evoked as a deeper or higher version of myself. I might experience it as an other, a second person entity, or I might experience it as just an extra energy or an extra quality of feeling. That's something like an object, right? So that's a very simple way to break it up, but I might come out of a spiritual experience going, oh, I really encountered a deeper version of myself, or I really encountered God, or some other particular culturally lensed version of a sacred other. Or maybe I just thought, wow, that was a very strange set of sensations and perceptions and energies. So it could be like a thing, it could be like a person, could be like a self. There's a number of different ways to interpret the experience, and our cultural history often give us the tools to do that. Right? So if you grew up in a village in India, you're much more likely to experience, say, the other as Krishna than if you grew up in the Midwest of the United States. Right? If you grew up in a Catholic village in France, you're much more likely to see Jesus or the Virgin Mary than somebody who grew up in, the middle of Timbuktu would. Right? So there's these cultural forces that frame the way we interpret our lenses. There's a kind of choice of lens, and then there's the phenomenon itself that we're evoking.
you were a spiritual teacher for a long time, a yogic practitioner and a meditator, right?
Yeah.
Perhaps you still
It's
are. I
kind
think.
of embarrassing to admit.
Do you have any exercises for invoking this other in people?
Well, I mean, you're going to experience it the way you experience it. So maybe you experience it as another, maybe you experience it as a self, maybe you experience it as an energy. But I think there are two basic ways to approach the synchronization of these different systems within us. One is to engage multiple systems in actions. So you can imagine someone who goes on a holy pilgrimage, right? They're going to climb a mountain on their knees or something like that, and they're going to do it while repeating a prayer. So they're undertaking a physical ordeal, but they're also disciplining their attention to stay focused on a particular set of ideas. And they also want to feel open. They want to feel devotional, right? So they are undertaking simultaneous mental, emotional, and physical disciplines. And there'll be moments in that practice where those efforts are about equal to each other and start to blend. And in those moments, the experience will be of something excessive relative to the ordinary experience. So that's an example of one of the many kinds of active modes you could do it in. But you also do it in a fairly passive mode, right? You can sit down for your meditation and you're going to sense your body. You're going to feel your entire emotional space. You're going to be aware of all your mental space, and you just keep tracking all of them and let them kind of settle into each other until they evoke something that's more like a general beingness.
Could this be classified as something of an awakening, or is that a separate thing?
Awakenings are, first of all, they're laden with a lot of assumptions. Why is waking better than sleeping? Like, there's a lot of way to deconstruct
I like sleep.
it. Right?
It's great.
I like sleep too. Right? There's a kind of old, let's say patriarchal, but we don't want to get too carried away with that word, kind of spiritual and religious tradition where bodies and animals and women and life and mortality are bad, and we're going to escape from that into abstract, impersonal light and illumination with no bodies. Right, so there's a little something perverse about that culturally. Nonetheless, there's still a lot of ways to talk about awakening and illumination and enlightenment and things like that that make sense to us. But we need to think about the difference between a state and a stage and a developmental practice. So lots of people have the experience of going into a state that feels like everything is solved, everything is radiant. everything is me, or I'm everything, or I don't even know. The difference between difference and non-difference is gone. Right? Fantastic, fantastic states. But then you come out of them. It's not really,
The
you haven't
mushrooms wear off.
matured to handle it.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between developmental maturation, and then that can proceed along different lines of development, and these states that everybody can access under different circumstances. And then there's the sense of a life of practice that's related to being awake. Right? Zen master Dogen said, you don't sit down and meditate to become the Buddha. You sit down and meditate because you are already the Buddha. Right? So in that sense, there's a way of thinking about awakening as absolutely simultaneous with a life of ongoing developmental effort. Because if awakening was truly awakening, how would you distinguish it from anything else? In that case, everything is already awakened, which is how it looks when you're in the awakened state. But then again, you need to grow and deepen as a human being in order to be able to show up like that in ways that are not toxic and deranged.
Yeah. It's important. That was a lot. And yeah, what you said about the patriarchal women are bad, animals are bad, like nature is bad. Let's just go off in this like wonderful head only spiritual place. It was like, oh, that does sound like some sort of spiritual bypass form of awakening. I do notice. Okay, and then you got to the part where one thing that I noticed is not that I would necessarily call myself awakened, right? But like I think I am obviously on my spiritual journey, and the closer I get, the more wisdom I find in other people's words, even when previously I wouldn't have. My dad is really into, he loves like ideas that you might call conspiracy theories, or somebody might call them like strange. He's really into aliens and things like that, and sometimes I have a hard time like talking to him. Well, we get along super well, and he's like the best dad ever. He actually he's like my first Patreon supporter. He just like he just donated my Patreon. He's the best. But like sometimes there's this kind of language barrier I think that we have, because he gets really into like this space of like the aliens and the government and stuff like that. And my friend said to me one time, why don't you just turn on like the new Spider-Man movie and just watch it with him? And it was so simple, and there was so much depth in it that I think previously I would have just discounted it and been like, oh, that's shallow, that's silly. But it's like, oh, there was such a depth in just like sitting, the idea of sitting next to my dad and like doing an activity together and enjoying something together, and like it almost makes me want to cry. And I found a lot of depth in that, and I think I continue to. I don't know if that's an awakening experience. I don't know, but I think finding depth in others is just part of is one of the stages of reality.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't call it a stage, because I don't think we ever outgrow it. I think it's one of the basic modes we always need to use, because we're relational beings, right? In a way, we experience ourselves through others. That's one of the great things about the theistic traditions that propose that your awakening takes place in the context of a divine other person, right? That sort of epitomizes all the possible depth relationships that you could have. And part of that is like how good are we, and this goes to the ethical and spiritual core of what it means to be a human being. How good are you at finding that in different kinds of human beings? Not that you necessarily want to spend time with all of them all the time, but can you presuppose that there's depth there in the forms that they're using to communicate? Right? And maybe those forms strike you as religious. Maybe those forms strike you as entertainment. Maybe they strike you as deranged. But if you're looking for depth, and if you are attending to and prioritizing communion with other beings, then there's always the opportunity to grow closer to them, and also to discover depth of understanding in your own case. And I think that as human beings, the other human is sort of like the special case. That's the privileged way that we're built to do it. Now, there's different kinds of, like, we get very elaborate with developmental theory and be like, oh, maybe he's looking for conspiracy theory because part of his psyche is at the mythic membership level, and that's why a superhero movie worked really well, because it displays mythic archetypes, right? There's a whole bunch of different ways to go at that, but it's much more straightforward in the actual moment of being with someone.
It's so there's this idea in spiral dynamics. What I actually want to say is it's interesting because after I said that, I feel much more relaxed in my body, and I feel more connected to you. And I think in this first 20 or so minutes, I was like, earlier before the podcast started, I asked you to like kind of make it easier to understand, because, well, part of it is because sometimes you say things and I'm just like, holy shit, like it's like drinking from a fire hose. And so, but I was also like, I think the audience, I want to make you palatable for an audience, because you have so much knowledge, and I'm like, I don't see, I want the everyman to be able to hear you and be able to take something from you. And then in the first 20 or so minutes, I was like, oh, I'm controlling him. That really sucks. Like I was feeling that I was controlling you and like stifling you, and I felt really bad about that. And then I shared something, and suddenly I felt more connected to you, and I'm happy about that.
Well, that's a good thing to notice, how those dynamics work, but at the same time, it just takes a little while to get comfortable with anybody.
I did want to say further. So in the spiral dynamic levels, spiral dynamics is like this. It's a tiered system of developmental growth, and so it starts off from when you're a baby, and the only thing you can do is like ask for food and whatever, and then it levels up to like Nelson Mandela or the Buddha or whatever. And one of the lowest stages is mythic membership, and in this Western society, it's kind of interpreted as like this is one of the early stages, but I think there's a lot more depth there. There's this guy Reese Paddock that I had on my podcast, and but also if you read Tyson Yom Kippur's book Sand Talk, it kind of displays this. Australian Aboriginals seem to, I would say, display something that is not this Western growth of spiral dynamics that starts with mythic and then goes upwards, but maybe branches out from mythic in a really deep way. And then it has its own structures that are very complicated, but like it's not that mythic is the lowest thing for them. It's actually that mythic is an incredibly complex worldview, and it's kind of, this is more of a 3D structure than a 2D structure, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk when you take on the notion of a developmental hierarchy, right? There's a lot of ways to do that wrongly that lead to at least being a dick, but maybe genocide or something like that, right? So we have to go like, okay, each of these stages, if it's really a stage of cognitive and social complexity, each of these stages has to include the previous stage in order to actually be a new stage. Like Einstein's theory of gravity wouldn't really be a better theory than Newton's if it didn't explain why Newton was correct in most cases. So post-mythic stages are faulty if they don't validate what's good about mythic stages. Right? You don't move on from one and then ditch the one from before. All the ones from before are traveling forward with you. So that's an important thing to appreciate. Another important thing to appreciate is it's not like the future is the best and the past is for fools, right? Anybody and any civilization, any cultural pool, any tribe, any nation throughout the 10,000 years of human history or 200,000 years of people before history, any one of them could have been more developed than us, more integrated, more insightful, more soulful, more transcendent, even better at building things than we are, right? So there's no simple correlation between the movement of time and advancement in depth. You might get more depth under conditions that look old-fashioned, maybe even that look primitive. right? I think one of the things we're seeing, one of the things that's challenging developmental communities, is this need to really appreciate indigenous perspectives much more richly. So Tyson does an excellent job on that.
Mm. Reese Paddock too, man. He blew my mind. Like, I saw him first post on Reddit, and he was saying that he was he does the welcoming ceremonies for and the land acknowledgement ceremonies, and all these people on Reddit were like, these are stupid. Like, I hate doing them in my office, and he handled them like a monk. Like, he just turned everything around so lovingly and just gently, and I just had to contact him after that. Like, I had a lot of the same opinions as those people. Like, it doesn't make me feel good to see people standing up, saying something that they have to say, and then sitting down with no feeling at all. Like, it doesn't inspire me, and I don't think it's helping anyone. But I didn't think it was helping anyone. And then I talked to Reese, and in his ceremonies, he brought so much wisdom and spirituality into them, and there was so much depth in his presence, and it was not this place of coming from my perspective. It was not coming from victimhood or like any of that sort of, you know, less wholesome. He got me to sit down. I don't know if we did this in the podcast. I don't believe we did, but and just talk about like what I liked most about the land that I was living in. And so I talked about the beach and like how beautiful it was to see the ocean, and it was like connecting to God. And he talked about his land, and then he said, "Where are your ancestors from?" And I talked about that, and it was just like we just got to know each other on this incredibly instantly deep level. And I would love to see businesses doing that. Like, before you meet up with this person, you talk about where your ancestors are from and what your favorite part of your land is. And it's hard to swindle somebody who you just had that conversation with.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, the way we've evolved is inside the biosphere. And the way we've evolved is in places, out of lands, with all the experiences and also the fields of energy and information that are involved in that. We're all from somewhere. And I think one of the things that when we look back at the major mythic membership religions, as a lot of people go, I can't really get behind Judaism or Christianity or Islam or something like that. It feels empty to me, right? And there's ways to reinvigorate it, and there's ways to find new paths, but they all involve something that looks a little bit indigenous. They all involve reconnecting with the elemental qualities of what it is to be an organism in the kind of world that we inhabit. That's also, I think, an important navigational tool for all spiritualities and religions going forward. Is they've got to be much more embodied, they've got to be much more ecological, they've got to be much more able to inhabit worlds, because what we're seeing, one of the problems that religion and spirituality we hope will solve for us is that our civilization is out of control relative to the biosphere, which we depend on. So to bring those things back in is very interesting, very ethically important going forward, very important as a touchstone for every kind of spirituality and religion now. But also it's just the way that we're built. Like, those are the environments, those are the things we grew up in, not only over the 200,000 years in which we've been anatomically modern humans, but the billion years in which we've been evolving organisms. They've been in the sunlight, in the air, on the ground, or the structure of our inner intelligence systems, which are mostly subconscious, draw on these very foundational factors that it's easy to forget about, and which have to be put back at the center of the mandala, so to speak.
Yeah, that the wisdom of the ancients thing makes a lot more sense now, because there's always that meme of, they didn't wash their hands before they ate or whatever. They were silly, like they died all the time. Why are they wise? But it's not their intelligence, it's the connection that they were able to have with the land around them and with each other. And I would assume a lot of them would have had a stronger intuition, especially from being outside all the time. And what I just said about the, you know, a business deal where you're talking about what you love about the land is not, it's not, swindling people is important in, you know, not swindling somebody, but what I actually got to after that was that I feel a connection with somebody, and if somebody is saying these things to me and it doesn't feel genuine, I would probably notice. I would get a feel, or I would get a feel for them, of who they are, and I would use my intuition to understand them better. And I think that's a piece of ancient wisdom that I would love to see back in traditional structures. I'm converting to Judaism right now with Elliot Redelman. You did a podcast with him, Psychotechnologies Live, by the way. And we also find that, like, that Judaism has these really formal, rigorous structures that are great in many ways. Like, they know how to hold a society together, but a lot of people, not all of them, there are some super embodied people, but, like, there does seem to be this kind of lack of, like, real embodiment and depth. Like, it seems like some people are just going through the motions, which is a bit sad. And it turns out now that I've realized that you're not actually trying to strike down religion and to crumble it into pieces like a bloody postmodern neo-Marxist. You're actually trying to fill it with embodiment and spirituality. Hooray.
I think the distinction you're making there is really important, because there are, whether it's Judaism or whether it's modernity or whether it's indigenous traditions, some people are doing them in a really deep embodied way, right? You feel their authenticity, you can trust them, it feels like they're acting as a signpost to something that you and other people can do that's deeply meaningful. And somebody else espousing the same thing doesn't necessarily have that, right? Just like everybody knows the world's round, who can explain it, right? There's only a few people who understand anything. They can pass the form on, right? Somebody could come in and propose an indigenous ritual, and you're just like, no, not you. And the next person proposing the same ritual, you're like, yes, exactly. Right? So we're looking for something that has more to do with being, more to do with depth, more to do with style in a way than it does with the particular cultural content that someone's espousing. Are you a part of any, something like intentional communities, or I have a few friends who have these communities that are, they call them intentional communities, and they are kind of, it seems like they're trying to mimic religion in this way. Like they have these communities of people together, and I think they hold festivals, and I think the idea is just to get people together and to, like, do something religious. Are you do you have any affiliation with any of those? I move between a number of them. I think we're entering an important phase historically, right? We've always had people trying these things. I think we're going to have to see a lot more cultural experimentation and a lot more collective sense-making between these communities. What I'm really interested in now are how could you go to these communities and give them the information from people who have tried these experiments already? What can they share with each other? How do they handle collapse? How do you start one? How do you get the information from somebody who feels like they have to leave one? Right? There's a lot of there's a whole art and a kind of general space in which these communities need to be held and encouraged. So I deal with a lot of people who are thinking about the space around and between intentional communities. I go in and out of a few. I don't necessarily want to live in any particular one of them, but I'm a strong advocate for that kind of experimentation done sensibly. And I think that becomes religion, right? Like, you can think of Judaism, like, at some point it was essentially a small community of people trying something a different way. And they were going to go through their experimental things. They were successful in accessing something that seemed like an intelligence beyond themselves that they could deal with and organize themselves culturally around. And then they spread out and absorbed more things and produced wise people who could show that there were pathways of depth within the forms that they'd already generated. But essentially, whether it's new or ancient, it all starts with something like intentional communities. And many of them will fail, but most of the seeds that fall off the tree won't grow either.
Of course, yeah. I I have this ongoing question about so the guilt behind religion, because I think it currently plays an important part in keeping the religion together. But obviously, guilt is something that, if we lived in a perfect world and we had a magic wand, we wouldn't feel, right. Although I don't quite know what a society without guilt would look like, but I know it's a feeling that I don't like to experience. So there's this. You could talk about like Christians, if you're bad to this person, you'll go to hell, and that feels bad to think about going to hell. But I think for some people in some developmental stages, that's the only morality they have, and the threat of punishment by going to hell is enough to maybe to stop them, right? It's kind of like this childlike point of view, and it seems to me like intentional communities don't want to have that. And I could be wrong, but don't want to have that like really overpowering like guilt, like you have to come to Shabbos dinner or else your mom is going to be guilty about you. It's not a mitzvah, right? You haven't fulfilled the deed, and so it's not you haven't done a good thing, and so it's. How do you create structure without creating this guilt?
Yeah, I think there is a role for something like guilt, and there's a lot of different terms, right? Guilt or shame or remorse. There's a lot of different variations of feeling bad relative to other people and relative to customs. With young children, in particular, the use of imagination and the infliction of what's sometimes called empathic distress is important, right? Mm-hmm. The young animal has to be reminded to feel bad relative to how they coordinate with other people, because we have a tendency to be narcissistically absorbed in our own concerns. So when you're parenting an individual or a community, there is a role for reminding people to feel bad about certain things. But I think of that more as a training wheel, right? Once you develop some competency in that, then you move on to a more sophisticated range of concerns. And at that range of concerns, you don't want to automatically feel guilty. You want to understand what that feeling is pointing towards. You want to be able to lean into remorse voluntarily so that you can be clarified and transformed by feeling bad. But you also want to grow toward a post-conventional kind of complexity of cognition and feeling, where the things that you actually feel bad about are not necessarily what other people think you should feel bad about, right? There is a sense in which maybe it is and maybe it isn't, that it becomes an arena for you to explore with your own intelligence what's actually going on for you authentically. Right? There might be something that we all do all the time and feel guilty, train each other to feel guilty about, and it's actually the best thing for us. Now, there might be another thing that we all do in the same way, and it's terrible. We should be like, well, why are we doing that? Let's do something that feels good, because we want to bring energy and life and joy. So there's a tendency in, let's say, the intentional communities of the last 100 years to lean away from feeling bad, to be psychologically informed, to think more about authenticity and freeing ourselves up and liberating ourselves. And that's important, but the thing they often forget in that practice is that it's also important to lean into bad feeling on purpose. It's okay to feel bad in exchanges with others. That's information. It teaches us something. And so many of the great spiritual and religious traditions suggest that it's very useful, that it refines and deepens the individual to become willing to take that on. Now, you mentioned Jordan Peterson at the beginning, right? One of the things Jordan brings up a lot is the role of exposure therapy, right? If you are traumatized by spiders and someone throws a spider on you, that doesn't help you, right? They've distressed you. It hasn't helped you. But if you volunteer to look at a spider when you're terrified of spiders, that can really be transformative. So that element of voluntariness, that element of intentionality is really important. So maybe when you're dealing with beginners or kids, you might want to inflict a kind of automatic distress pattern. But when we start to deal with actual adult, mature human beings, you want as much as possible for it to be voluntary. You want them to understand and agree to it. Otherwise, it is a little bit oppressive, and it doesn't have the transformational capacity that a voluntary procedure has.
The thing that really stuck out at me there is leaning into remorse. Can you go more into that?
Sure, and it's one of the things that a psychoanalytically informed society is not very good at talking about. Remorse is, in my mind, it's a developmental opportunity, right? No one else gets to say that it's my fault. I get to choose that it's my fault, right? And what that means is there's a disconnect between my action and the part of my brain that is aware of an action I took and my values. I think there's something wrong with what I did. And that's a disconnect. It's a cognitive dissonance. It's an unpleasant feeling of two different parts of ourselves arguing with each other. And what we normally do is choose one or try to distract ourselves from that inner conflict. But if we lean into that inner conflict, we not only gain a certain kind of strength, and we not only take over some of the energy that we were rejecting, but we allow those two parts of ourselves to be more interconnected, right? Our opportunity to be an integrated whole being goes up if we can bring those together. So let's say I did an activity, just sort of automatically, and I don't want to be blamed for it. That's very natural. And maybe I don't have to be blamed for it. But if I step into the position, at least in my feelings, and perhaps with another person, of taking that blame, I'm in a position where my awareness of the action and the values and the way I want to be presented, they're fighting each other. But in that fight, they're touching each other. They're exchanging. They're growing together. So that increases our overall interconnectedness in the degree to which we sort of learn to take on leaning into remorse as a practice. It's one of many kinds of cognitive dissonance, but it's a really important one.
Wow. Okay. I just want to summarize this as best as I can. So let's say I eat a donut. I didn't want to eat a donut, and I'm on a diet, and so I ate the donut, and then I feel bad. But there's a remorse because, let's say part of me is like, that was a great donut. I'll probably eat another donut soon, and then a part of me is like, no, I'm on a diet, and they clash, right? What you're saying is, don't go distract yourself. I shouldn't go eat chocolate cake to distract myself from the donut situation, or like whatever, play video games or or just talk to someone. Like, don't distract myself. Sit in with the conflict and just watch it. And what's interesting is that you didn't say try to resolve it. You didn't say try to resolve these two parts of you, which is what I would have expected. You actually said lean into the conflict and just watch it. Like, just watch the two parts of you fighting.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, another way to think about it is that you are going to be the thing that they have in common, right? It's like two warring parties, and you're going to go in and you're going to touch both of them. You're going to grab one of their hands each, and the energy between them is going to flow through you, and you're going to stay there as long as there's that energy until that energy is absorbed into you in the middle.
Wow.
There are a lot of meditative and contemplative practices around being a good container and staying present with things. And those are great. The way the instructions are given are great. But I think there's a little bit of this need to voluntarily lean into the negative feeling that often gets overlooked because it's unpleasant for us. We kind of casually don't want to lean into that part. But it is what makes us better human beings. If we're willing to undergo the friction between our actions and our values, that's how we become a more moral being.
The way you talked about grabbing things and being like the conduit between them was really powerful to me, because it doesn't quite feel like living in this inner conflict and getting caught in the thought spiral of this action. It actually kind of feels like more like observing empathetically those two parts and just watching them almost like children or something.
Yeah, there are a lot of therapeutic mechanisms that help people do that, internal family systems, and right, there's various tactics you can use to flip your interpretation of experience, or go, okay, there's that perspective and there's that perspective, and maybe I can get them to talk to each other. So there's a lot of more elaborate techniques people can use mentally to help with that. But I think the basis of it is this decision to voluntarily undergo the emotional and the sensory dimension of that friction. Which, again, is one of the reasons why you get people in religions who are I mean, religion is famous for containing people who espouse the religion and are terrible human beings, maybe even evil human beings,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the fact that you can espouse something, it doesn't matter if the rest of the being, particularly the subconscious levels of the person, are operating independently of what they espouse, then the espousing doesn't mean anything.
Mm.
But how do you get the rest of yourself to get on board with a practice, with an idea, with a value? You're going to have to undergo a bit of an internal struggle because these systems are not automatically synchronizing. You've got to lean into that. You've got to intentionally synchronize them, which might feel bad, at least at first.
There's a large group of people. I talked with a lot of people about this sort of stuff, IFS and embodiment. And there's quite a few people that I talk to, like 1 in 10 or maybe even more, who say they can't feel their body, like emotions don't show up in their body, or it feels to me like they would have a hard time with something like this. Do you encounter people like that?
Yeah. Now, it's a mix of people, right? Some people are just built differently, right? Some people
Yeah.
are born with their lungs outside their body. Some people don't have color vision, right? So there's a lot of, right? We can't assume everybody has the same range of capacities. However, that said, there are a lot of people who just haven't been encouraged to develop the skill set involved in sensing the body. So there are various practices, gymnastics or Tai Chi or self-sensing, or there's all kinds of things you can do to try to become more awake to the subjective sensory realm of the body as a container for action. Yeah, but it's not going to work for everybody. There's some people who that's never really going to work for them, and they've got to use a different approach.
Yeah, we're all different. I often think about the role of, like, for instance, psychopaths in society. Like, it seems like they're just evolutionarily present for a reason. I mean, you see people who can't feel empathy, and it seems like society treats them like they have a disease, and they do have it does cause issues for the rest of society, right? But, like, I actually kind of think of them as something that could be a huge aid to us if we would create space for them.
To create space and provide the challenges that would develop them into a version of that temperament that could be of use to us.
Yep.
Right? Because a psychopath who can't control themselves is no good. But we know there's a large percentage of psychopaths in our military and in our legal system and in our police departments, and they aren't all bad. Some of them are really useful. Sometimes we need someone who's going to feel very relaxed and unthreatened under stressful conditions of conflict and danger. That's really useful, but it's only really useful if that person is domesticated, if that person has some moral understanding, has some self-control, can follow the task that they're trying to perform and not just deviate into attacking a random stranger on the street.
Yeah.
So I think there's a level of, and this is one of the things you get from spiral dynamics, integral theory, from all of the developmental frameworks, is there's always a richer, more sophisticated, and deeper way to do anything.
You I believe you have a group of people dedicated to preparing for I don't want to say apocalyptic scenarios, but disasters.
I've been trying to organize conversations between people around something like a metamodern or liminal form of preparation, because we are in an area where we expect disruptions, but we don't know what those disruptions are going to look like. So we have to be much more flexible and multi-directional and humane than a lot of the people who are preparing for disaster. We have to be able to help other human beings and recognize the dimensions of the distress they might be under if something goes wrong. We have to be able to work together better. We have to be able to find each other. And sometimes that maybe is going to look like finding people who are just local. Because today, a lot of the best people you want to contact are digital and international. Which is fine as long as the internet's still functioning.
Yeah.
Not so great if you suddenly have to survive with the jerk down the street.
Yeah.
So there's these different skill sets, but I think by and large, preparation, preparedness, that's a kind of axis around which we could do cultural integration. Right? And cultural integration for me is the key process that allows society to start to become religious. It brings together all the types of people. An analogy to those different internal systems that I was thinking about as spirituality, the social systems have to come together. The genres of experience, the classes of people, what can they come together on? If you live in a society where everybody's given top-down instruction on a particular religious narrative from birth, okay, maybe that's the thing that it can use, but we don't live in a society like that anymore. So what are the things that we could bring everybody together on? Well, preparedness for disasters, which are unpredictable but also imminent, that's one of the things everybody has to have a hand in. And also, I think, thinking toward it brings people who are spiritual and intellectual and philosophical down out of the clouds, asks them to think about how they're really going to heat their house and feed their family if something goes crazy. And it asks us to be present to the historical moment, right? I think it's one important way to be mindful, to be authentic, is to recognize we're in a mood of catastrophe, right? Regardless of any of the possible catastrophes we face, there's a general sense people are sharing, which is this apocalyptic sentiment, and we need to be able to show up in that mood, not retract from it, to have a proactive sense of it, which is not just having plans and schemes and having a bunker or something like that. It's also letting it break your heart, right? It's also grieving for the possible loss of ecosystemic balance, the loss of the goals of civilization, the possibility that a lot of people are going to die or get sick or turn into factions and attack each other. This stuff is very real, and we should grieve through it. We should try to show up in the world by allowing that to really distress us. Not in a way that makes us depressed and dysfunctional, but we should be willing to undergo the rigor of how awful that stuff really is.
Yeah, feeling into it seems one of the first steps to preventing it, if at all possible.
Yeah, whether we can prevent it or not, we have to feel into it either way.
Yeah. Do you believe in any conspiracy theories? My dad sponsored my Patreon, so I want to bring a little bit of him into this.
Okay. What's your dad's name?
Jim.
Jim. I bet Jim and I would agree on a few things.
I think you would too.
It's tricky because I think a lot of the problem, what we call conspiracy theory, is really the tone that people are using with each other, right? Somebody talks to you and you think, oh, this is a conspiracy theorist. It doesn't mean there's nothing to what they're saying. It means they're saying it in a way that is off-putting or is going to provoke a counter-argument against them. It's so clearly lopsided that it's problematic, but the actual content is not necessarily a problem, right? There are real conspiracies. Out of any 10 conspiracies you've heard of, probably half of them are correct. And there's probably another 5 that you've never heard of. And they're going on too. And they're going on at all levels. They're going on between small groups of people and large networks, and maybe the energies of the world. Maybe our DNA is a conspiracy within us, right? The genes are up to something, which isn't necessarily what we want them to be doing. So there are all kinds of layers of collaboration and control built into the system. And when you look historically at what humans have done together and what's going on now, there's a lot of information that points out that the dominant cultural narratives are not what we are pretending they are. Right? It's not the case that authorities are telling you the truth. It's not the case that people are working on everyone's benefit. It is the case that networks of people have conscious and unconscious tendencies to distort the future and skew things in different ways. So I think that's all very straightforward. Some of those I find more reasonable than others. There's lots I'm sure I don't know enough about to make an accurate assessment of. I will say that over the course of my life, A lot of things that sounded like total nonsense to me now seem plausible. But that doesn't necessarily explain why people want to talk about it. Right? There's a great book on Wilhelm Reich, who created body therapy and coined the term sexual revolution. It's by Robert Corrington, and in the opening chapter, he says that this was a guy who actually created dynamic, transformative changes in multiple genres of science, but he was also a narcissistic megalomaniac. And this is a guy who was actually being interfered with by communist and American forces in his work. There were spies stealing his stuff. But he was, in addition to that, a paranoid schizophrenic.
Oh no.
So these things are not oppositional. Right? So the fact that there are real conspiracies doesn't mean you're not paranoid when you think about conspiracies. It can be both. Right? Because there's something psychological and social that makes us interested in them that's in addition to whether they're happening or not. And one of the things that makes us interested in them at this point in history is a lot of people are suffering the absence of the great mythic stories that make sense of the world for us. And so they feel like they have to individually or in online groups get together with people and make up a story that is mythically exciting and explains all of the upsetting information. And so that motive is interesting. It's natural. We should criticize it at times. But none of that says whether any particular piece of information they're on about turns out to be true or false.
Yeah. That sums up a lot of what I think as well. Yeah. One thing that he's really into is the world being a simulation. It's funny because I'm really into manifestation, and I think the world being a simulation and manifestation are very intertwined. Like, I have just noticed that if I write down what I want and I imbue emotion into it, and then I think about it a lot, I get what I want. And it's hard to separate that from this idea of the world being a simulation. Do you have any beliefs on like the simulation theory or anything like that?
It's tricky. I mean, I think at every moment of history, we tend to take the dominant medium that we're using to process our information and try to imagine reality through that, right? So we might have thought it was a great book 1,000 years ago, the book of the world, and now we're like, oh, pixelated digital universe. Maybe we're just in a pixelated digital universe of some kind, man. So it's important to see that unfolding historically. I think it's also important to say, as much as you can make a great argument where it's statistically more probable that we're in a simulation than not, what does that mean? Because the thing you're calling the simulation is the thing everybody else is calling reality. So that's what reality is. So by calling it a simulation, you're just saying it's reality again, in a way. So there's that as a critique. Now, I think more to the heart of what you're saying is there's a possibility, and I think a need developmentally, to experience the world as a participatory psychophysical realm. And we see this in shamanism, we see this in magical traditions, we see this in some versions of the mythic membership traditions, and we also see this in some versions of modern and postmodern culture. Right? Sort of, you create your own reality. That can be very vapid, it can be very solipsistic and narcissistic, but it also can suggest that you need to be an active participant in your experience, that there isn't a fundamental separation between the self and the world. They're somehow part of a continuum. And that continuum is complex. Most of it's being modulated by your subconscious. It involves forms of information exchange and patterning that you can't possibly get on top of, but which you could participate in. And you can participate in various ways that sometimes look like choosing, sometimes look like the clarifying of desire, sometimes look like releasing. There's a lot of different sub-skills involved. But I think it is one of the classical forms of spiritual and human development to move into the sense that your world is a realm and that you're a participatory figure in that realm rather than just an object in an environment.
I think in the when I think about my dad, but I also hear it kind of reflected in other people who are into these conspiracy. I'm saying conspiracy theories not in a pejorative way, but just because I don't have another label for it, alternative theories. There's this persistent message of the masses are asleep and they're waking up. And I think that's a big part of the simulation idea is that I have realized that we're in a simulation, and maybe my dad has these spiritual experiences, right? He's a very spiritual person. So, like what you said with, you didn't call it embodiment, you said having an other experience. I think that might be happening for him. And like, it's possible that he's like, maybe you call it having another experience and he calls it like understanding that we're a simulation or something. And then I think he's trying to get other people to be like, you can have this experience, you can see outside of the simulation. Some part of that, I think is true for me, or from my perception of him.
There's a thing to keep an eye on there among human beings, which is that impulse to want to then wake the other people up, because it's a very natural impulse, but it's also sort of pejorative, right? It's sort of a lot of people who think they're in possession of a truth that the other fools and sheep don't see actually behave in a way that's not good for themselves and distances themselves from others. So you have to then stand back and say, is this actually enriching your relationships? Is this making you healthier? Is it making you smarter? Are people walking away from engagements with you feeling good, or feeling like there's something fucked up about what you're trying to say? Right? So there's different ways that it could go. It's very natural when you've had state change experiences to feel that people are asleep. And it's very easy to turn that into an aspect of your personal pride, as if you're awake all the time and they're asleep all the time, when really we're all phasing through different degrees and intensities of consciousness, and it requires a life of practice in order to stabilize and hone that, and it requires a set of interpersonal skills to do that gracefully with other people. So that's one of the things that one hopes a religion provides, or at least communities oriented around the cultivation of wisdom, is how do you actually handle that? How do you go through those experiences, however you happen to personally understand them, in a way that's graceful, in a way that's compassionate, in a way that makes other people learn from you, rather than just get put off by your sense that they're asleep and you're awake. Right? So there's a lot of people go through these things personally, and they don't get any social reinforcement or cultivation. So it's a bit like, learning to speak on your own in the woods as a child, rather than actually being educated with other humans to speak a language. And this is true all the way up the developmental scale. So there's all kinds of fantastic and real experiences that are transformational, but then the next step is, how do you integrate that into your life? How do you integrate that into a community? How do you do that in a way where you're being ethical and nice and useful to other people?
Yeah. Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head. This has devolved into me asking for unofficial therapy from you. I think, it's very personal to me, this whole thing. It's like, one of my main things here is like, one of my biggest questions is like, how do I better connect with my dad, but also how do I connect with people who I don't agree with? Like, it's, with my dad, like, I've just found different languages for speaking to him. Like, he thinks that, he believes that the world blinks on and off like 1 trillion times per second, and he says things like that. But to me, it's like, oh, maybe he's just understanding, like, maybe my interpretation of that would be something like being on the knife's edge of reality, like constantly being on the present in such a way that a moment is never a measurable amount of time. Like, it keeps getting infinitesimally smaller.
Well, I don't know if I can speak to the particulars of it becoming infinitesimally smaller, but I think there is, on the one hand, a real need, and this is one of the things religion is supposed to do, right, is teach us to figure out the languages that allow us to take other people seriously and back that up with an emotion that treats other people in a basically benign, loving fashion, and that assumes that wisdom can come at us from any source if we're open to it. As well as just loving family members and understanding there's something to eldership, even though it shows up in different forms. So there's all those practical things. And then there's the sense of what we can actually learn, like how do we find personally a way into the depth of what other people are saying about the structure of reality. Because that's a really useful skill set. If you can find depth that's psychoactive for yourself in a variety of different forms, then you can start to draw on the wisdom of all the traditions, but also the wisdom that seems to fall outside of the traditions.
Psychoactive.
You know,
like
I mean,
that.
yeah. Anybody can, you know, it's a really important skill set, I think, to have in a fractured world. Because you don't know, we're not all going to gather around the Torah in the temple, right? We might do a little bit of that, but we may also stumble upon some graffiti on a wall or hear a crazed person on the internet or someone in our family says something that's very peculiar. It might be off-putting, it might be intriguing, right? There's all these fractious, kaleidoscopic sources of information that overwhelm us from every direction in the contemporary world. So I think we do need to help each other get better at the specific skill set of refining strange forms and drawing depth and wisdom out of them.
There's this idea of a Zen koan and a Koan, and it's a, for people, I'm sure, I'm positive you know what it is, but it's like a little, oftentimes a 2-sentence story, and it's not meant to be analyzed intellectually. It's meant to be psychoactive, like, is the best thing I could say. It puts you in a different state of mind, and it's not something that is easily transmissible, like, here's the answer, this is how you're supposed to feel. But one of them is like, a man goes to the butcher shop, and he says, what's the best meat? And the butcher says, they're all the best meat. But what you were saying is kind of like, I just thought of Zen koans, like seeing a person on the street ranting and raving, and then having a psychoactive experience from their modern shamanistic, perhaps untrained ramblings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the form of the Zen koan that comes into Chinese Buddhism from the Nagarjuna and the Indian teachers and the Persian teachers as well, it's interesting because they speak so highly of these koans, these little bits of conversation that they've preserved over time. And you think, okay, well, that's an interesting little puzzle to play with. But when you read what they're saying these are the essential distilled essence of the Dharma. And if you cracked these cases, you would understand everything and attain the Buddha mind. Now, that's a pretty big claim for a little bit of verbal puzzle. But one of the ways to understand that is that it's teaching you the skill set of discovering an illumination, discovering a wisdom or a transcendental shift in yourself from within anything that seems puzzling and contradictory. And if you were to get that, then everything around you would open up as if it was the key to the Dharma or the Logos or the Torah or the invisible spirit of the world.
Wow. The thing that's sticking in my head right now is previously you talked about embodying, not so much trying to wake people up, but embodying wisdom, depth or embodiment. I don't know what it is, and it reminded me. I heard you talk on Psychotechnologies Live about you kind of compared Jesus and the Buddha, and we were talking about that, Elliot and I, afterwards. And the Buddha does this thing where he has these great bits of wisdom, and somebody does something to him and he'll turn it around, and then they were enlightened. But Jesus doesn't, now that you said it, Jesus doesn't actually have a lot of, like, he doesn't seem to there aren't stories of him saying something and enlightening people, right? It seems like Jesus is embodied, I think. There's something like, but we know that he had these great followers around him and people would worship him, so there was something that he was giving off. And I wonder if it was just kind of a general embodiment and instead of like this, I don't know. Can you explain the difference there?
Well, if we assume there was a Jesus,
Yeah,
what we see a lot of there is
reality
it's the
isn't
symbol.
important.
It's the symbol of an embodied being, right? That's what stayed with us, is this character on the cross in particular, right? It's a gesture that he makes, which is revelatory, not so much the sayings. Now, that said, there are sayings, right? The parables are fantastic, and the Dead Sea Scrolls include all kinds of interesting things. If you read the Gospel of Thomas, which isn't included in the Bible, it reads like Zen koans. Everything out of Jesus' mouth is, lift a stone and I am there, split a piece of wood and I am there, or where 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, there I am. Right? These are very interesting phrases that have an illuminating potential as discursive communications. But the primary importance of Jesus that we inherit culturally is in the symbol, it's in the demonstration, it's in the figure of a man who takes the suffering of the world into a mortal body, which is transfigured as a divine body. So I think that one of the big differences, like you're saying, a lot of the Buddhist teachings, it's more analytic, it's more verbal, it's more of a communication and less of a demonstration. With the Christian path, we've stylized it over the centuries to focus more on the demonstration part than on the statements part, even though they both have both.
Mm.
It's an interesting thing. Like one of my favorite examples is there's a school of Buddhism where it's proposed that you can't get enlightened in this lifetime, but you can call upon the Buddha of compassion. And then when you die, you'll go to another realm, which is so nice that it's very easy for you to get enlightened. So all you have to do is have faith and call upon this divine human avatar of compassion. And you're like, well, that sounds fairly Christian. And then you can read Meister Eckhart, which is a great Christian mystic. And he's like, well, the birth of the Messiah is actually the Spirit coming into the Virgin, which is your empty mind transforming you. And you're like, that sounds a lot like Zen Buddhism. So the lines are blurred. I think, from my point of view, one of the important things to at least take advantage of as an option is that the categories of religion are actually different than the ones we think they are. Right? There's no reason to think, if we think there's something called a Christian, do you get to be that just because you say you're a Christian? Or is it a specific type of practice? And then could people be doing that practice, feeling those things, believing those things, but we call them Hindus sometimes? Right? Are we making the categories appropriately or not? If religion is a real thing, if it's an organic, functional phenomenon in the world, then that's a little bit different than just what people identify themselves as. If a cucumber told me it was a fish, I wouldn't believe it. So the whole thing about science is we look for some functional patterns in addition to the identification tendencies. And it may be that there are types of religion that are quite apart from the way we normally socially categorize religions.
What is in your daily practice?
Usually I'll do a focus-oriented meditation first thing in the morning, sort of get my brain in gear, sometimes holding a single point of focus, sometimes doing something like a subtle mantra routine. Usually I have a morning exercise routine where I try to exercise physically, emotionally, and mentally at the same time. A lot of my practice through the day is in engagement with my partner, right? Relational work, sort of mutual shadow work, conversation, contemplation of the world. We try to have our sexuality be part of our practice. I try to spend a lot of time in nature, and I try to use my time in nature to do more inquiry type practices. The exploration of the components of the self and the liberation from different reactive patterns that come up. And then there's a lot of just, I've been fortunate insofar as where I've gotten to in my life now. I can do a lot of allowing myself to be absorbed in some other thing that feels wonderful.
I might wrap up now. I was wondering though, I was looking for I heard on another podcast that you had a sexual tantra podcast and I couldn't find it. Is it on YouTube?
Yeah, if you go to the audio of the integral stage,
it's in the integral stage. Okay.
It's in the integral stage. So the audio is all scattered, but if you go to the YouTube, it's divided into sub-series. So there's one, I think, called Sex, Gender, and Relationships. I think there's a dozen or so interviews on that theme.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to the audio, then it'll just say that in front of particular interviews.
Okay. So we can find you on the integral stage. And, of course, Bruce Alderman, who has been on this podcast before, and that was a great episode.
Bruce is
Can we
fabulous.
find you anywhere else? Yeah, he's great.
Well, you can find me on Facebook. You can find me. I'm sort of running the whatisemerging.com website now. I've got Layman Pascal Substack. But generally, if you want to find out what I'm doing in the moment, usually I just put that on Facebook. Otherwise, my writings are Emerge and Substack and the Integral Stage.
Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on. Please check out Layman if you want to become more embodied, improve your sexuality, become enlightened. I'm sure everyone is enlightened by the end, so you probably won't need that. But if you have friends who want to become enlightened, check out Layman Pascal.
I'm glad we hit our goal of total audience enlightenment. It's been lovely talking.
Total audience enlightenment. All things are one, as my dad says. Yeah, thank you so much
Jim.
for coming on, Layman. I'm sure he'll listen to this. That was really fun. I thank you for playing along with that.
Yeah, this was great. Nice to talk with you.